come and almost gone, but it's the season of fresh new love. And when people see lovers' names carved on a tree, some people think that it's sweet. Well, I don't. I just think it's really surprising how many people carry a knife on a date. Today is National Speak in Complete Sentences Day. This day is, yay, this day is dedicated to using proper sentence structure while speaking or writing. And in fact, you can even celebrate this day while you text. So no LOL or ASAP or IDK or LMK or LMAO, for those who know what it means. I hear a couple of young laughters out there. So if you must laugh out loud as soon as possible, you will need to say or type it completely. So we will sing a verse of a Susan Bullock will do our Rotary Minute, and please take a seat.
Hi. Excuse me. Good afternoon. Welcome to the challenge of Bullock and Minute. I wanted to remind us today that it is human nature to become like those you are with. That we cannot help picking up phrases, we cannot help being like those we spend time with. It is so instinctive that hospitals put babies with strong hearts next to babies with weak hearts because it makes their hearts beat stronger. I want to thank you for letting me come to Rotary. I think it's important that we spend time with people who challenge us, who make us uncomfortable, who pressure us. Many times I have been pressured by you people who I love mostly. I have been pushed into helping children with shoes. I have been pushed into going to a high school when I haven't been in one since I graduated. I have been pushed to leading the volunteer campaign, which God knows I did not volunteer for. But I believe strongly that it's important to be in a room where I am not the smartest, the strongest, or the kindest. So I would like to thank you for being that room for me.
Our guest introductions today will be done by Stan Martindale. And while he's making his way up here, I'll just say I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here today and new faces.
We have a large number of guests today, and it is our tradition that our guests stand up when they're introduced and remain standing until we get through the whole list. Rayhan Reza has a guest, Felicia Cunningham. Okay, there we go.
That would be Felicia.
Oh, sorry, Felicia. Scott Teeter has a guest, Sam Teeter. Hi, Sam.
My guest is my son, Sam, my oldest, who is in town with us for a few weeks on his way after graduating from Washington University in St. Louis with a master's degree in computer engineering. And he'll be moving to Austin, Texas. Has a job with a company called Psycor, which is a software artificial intelligence company.
Lee Morris has a guest, Susan Alexander.
Hi, Susan.
And Susan has turned in her application. Gordon Lansford has two guests. First, Jeff Pavone, who is the general manager of the Cyrus Hotel. Hi, Jeff. And also Stephanie Gasson, and she is the director of sales at the Cyrus Hotel. Did I get, I got one wrong, I think. Rayhan Reza has Emily Stanley here, or do you have two guests? Hi, Emily. Hi, Emily. Lucky DeFries has a long list of guests. And let me start with Pat Dorsey. Hi, Pat. And Pam DeFries. Hi, Pam. Hi, Pam. Ashley Brocksterman. Hi. And we also have Sarah Brocksterman. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Sarah. We have Patrick McKissick. Hi, Patrick. Carly Davis. Hi, Carly. Carla Whitaker. Hi, Carla. And Tammy King. Hi, Tammy. Have I missed anybody? Welcome to Rotary.
Last week, I said that the Easter Seals Capper Foundation was its last week, and I made a mistake because this month, this is still May, and so once more, our cup money will go to Easter Seals Capper Foundation. I hope you will be generous. We have a few announcements today. Our Rotary International Toast will recognize the Rotary Club of Dhaka Mid-City in Bangladesh. This club was chartered in 2014. It currently has 29 members, and the president is Qazi Farouk Ahmed. So let's raise our glasses in a Rotary toast to the Rotary Club of Dhaka Mid-City. Hear, hear. And I have a feeling Rayhan may have something to do with that. This coming week is the Rotary Youth Leader Exchange Academy, Art Ryla in Lawrence, and you've got a little bit of information on your tables if you're interested in meeting some of the students. There's a couple of opportunities for Rotarians to do that, so if you wish to make the trip over, please do so. Leo Espinoza, would you please come up here? Leo is one of our very newest members. And Leo is, I hope I get this right, a career advisor at Topeka High School. He is sponsored by Melissa Masoner, and he is one of maybe our very first community service member. So Leo, I would like to present you with your red badge, and we look forward to seeing you here as often as possible. We look forward to you turning your red badge into a blue badge, and after you do orientation, you'll figure out how to do that. But we're so pleased that you are our newest member. So let's rise and give him a warm Rotary welcome. So even though he's community service, we hope that he'll be able to get here a number of times. It is not too late to register for the service trip to Guatemala, July 15th through 21st, and at this moment we have either 4 or 6 people from our club going. 2 of those are Laurel Vogt and Gianfranco Pizzini, and they are some of our very newest members. There's a number of people going from Topeka South as well. If you have an interest, please see Linda or me, and we can get that registration information to you. Tonight at the Glacier's Edge Winery, we will have a social from 5:30 to 7:30. We had, at last count, 32 people signed up, so if you didn't sign up, please come anyway. It should be lots of fun. There will be a cash bar, and we will have hors d'oeuvres. I hope you will remember that June 14th at Topeka Country Club, we will have a celebration banquet. It will celebrate the things that we've done this year. We'll have a nice meal together and have a social time. And if you haven't had a chance to register online yet, you'll find a little card on the place setting that looks like this. We're trying to make this as easy as possible for you. So on this, you can say whether you're coming to the reception for Blanche, or to the banquet, or both. You can make your meal selection. So we really, really hope that you can come. We do have a deadline of about a week from now for a count, so if you could get that done really soon, that would be very, very helpful. So thank you in advance for coming. I think our speaker today will be introduced by Lucky DeFries. So Lucky, if you'll make your way up here, that would be great.
My pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Jessica Dorsey. I think Stan already indicated I had several guests today. Jessica's mom, Pat, is with us here. Pat, my wife, started teaching again in 1975 at Highland Park Central, and our families have been friends ever since. My daughter, Ashley, went to high school with Jessica's here today, and our little granddaughter, Sarah, is with us also. The other four guests that I have are all part of the administration at the Washburn University School of Law and are very familiar with our speaker here today. With that, let me give you just a little background on Jessica. Jessica grew up in Topeka, graduated from Washburn Rural High School in 2000, the University of Kansas in 2004 with a BA in English, and then came to Topeka, back to Topeka, where she obtained her degree from the Washburn University School of Law in International Comparative Law. She then moved to the Netherlands, Utrecht, where she completed her LLM Masters of Law in Public International Law. She specializes in human rights and international humanitarian criminal law, has worked in think tanks such as the TMC Asser Institute in The Hague, and has been an associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, since 2013. In the course of her work, she's presented before the United Nations, both in New York, Geneva, and Nairobi, and was invited as an expert by the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights in 2017 to consult on a common position on the use of armed drones. She has taught at the University of Utrecht, Duke University, and just recently has accepted an offer to teach at the University of Amsterdam starting in the fall, where she will teach human rights and international law. She'll also remain a core member of the TransAD working group, the transnational academic network on the study of armed drones. With that, please welcome Jessica Dorsey.
Thank you, Lucky. Thanks very much to you, to your wife Pam, and to Grace, and the rest of you here at Rotary. I really appreciate being here, the opportunity. I'm actually just in town visiting my parents on holiday, but I thought, why not add a little bit of work in there in the mix? I didn't realize all the pressure for having to speak in full sentences today. Although I should do that, that's what lawyers are paid to do, but so I'll do my best on that front. Today I'm going to talk about the use of armed drones, their implications on current and future warfare. This may not be something that a lot of you think about on a daily basis, and that's okay. It's something I think is a very important topic and only becoming more and more important, and I'll tell you some of the reasons why. I intend to be a bit provocative, and I think, harkening back to an earlier invitation, I do think we learn a lot from one another by engaging in discussion. So on that note, I'm very open to taking questions as they come. We don't need to wait till the very end, so if you have an interjection or a question during the presentation, please feel free to put a hand up and jump right in. And with that, I think we can just get started. I'll give a bit of a background. I do understand there was an op-ed or a front page story this morning in the Topeka Capital Journal. I didn't read it. Someone told me right beforehand, so I'm cheating a little here. But that was about drones. The Highway Patrol, etc., are starting to use those. It's my hope, again, not having read the article, it's my hope that they're not going to be using armed drones, but you never know. I'm going to be limiting my remarks today to the use of armed drones. So I'm talking about systems that deliver weapons or are used for surveillance in conflict zones. So thinking about armed conflict in war zones and that kind of thing. Either being used, again, for surveillance purposes to share intelligence with particular countries, to aid in targeting particular individuals. So I hope that that zooms in on the kind of drones that we're talking about today. And again, I really hope that the Topeka Highway Patrol or the Kansas Highway Patrol is not in that business yet. What we're talking about are machines that have been used mostly since 9/11 and the war on terror, which I do understand now that we're using different terminology for that. But U.S. is of course not the only actor in this field. A lot of other countries have been acquiring this technology and putting it into use. But the U.S. has kind of led the way, along with Israel, in using drones in targeting operations. We Americans used them for the first time in a terrorist context in 2002 in Yemen, where we carried out the first strike. It certainly was not the last strike, and it's become more and more popular as the administrations have continued. So that was back, of course, in George W. Bush administration. Barack Obama took that and ran with it, if we could say it lightly in that sense. Drone strikes were manifestly increased under the Obama administration, and they haven't slowed down under the current administration. But again, as I mentioned, the U.S. isn't the only actor in this field. A lot of the work that I do now in Europe looks at how European states are assisting either the U.S. or other allies with providing intelligence or infrastructure. So looking at how, for example, in Germany, Ramstein Air Force Base is being used as a forward operating base for operations in Afghanistan. Sigonella Air Force Base in Italy is also being used to run operations in Libya and northern African countries. So in that sense, even though the United States has been sort of a leader in carrying out the strikes, they are helped by allies as, this is not a new phenomenon. Allies help one another. But this is, drones, why we focus on drones is that they kind of, they allow force to be used in ways that conventional weapons platforms such as a Joint Strike Fighter or an F-16 don't. And so that's why we kind of look at this particular technology specifically. They're also known as unmanned aerial vehicles or remotely piloted aircraft, so we use those sort of interchangeably. So we're thinking about a machine that doesn't have a pilot in the cockpit, and it's surveilling or circling around or carrying out strikes without an actual human being in it. It's remotely piloted in that sense. One advantage that drones theoretically have is that they do have the capability to be more precise, because they are able to sort of hover around particular areas and carry out surveillance in places for longer periods of time rather than just a one sweep over an area. So in that sense, they can strike at a moment where there aren't civilians located. So again, that's theoretically possible, but it's also theoretically possible, and is what we're seeing actually evidence of, is that when drones, they can also be set into areas where you wouldn't have conventional methods like F-16. So in the tribal areas in Pakistan, for example, drones can surveil those areas where F-16s won't normally have any access to. So in that sense, they're also being used increasingly in places where we previously hadn't had a lot of activity. There are morality and ethical issues behind this, and I don't want to get too much into this, but I think mostly, obviously, being a lawyer, we focus a lot on the legal aspects. I look at the legal framework governing the use of force, whether it's with a drone or an F-16 or otherwise. But so just to be aware, when I highlight that those are out there. The main issue, the reason that I focus so much on it from a human rights perspective, is that there is a marked increase in civilian casualties, where we don't get the kind of transparency and accountability that we deserve as a public. In the United States, we don't have much of an idea. With the current administration, we're having even less of an idea of where these operations are taking place, against whom, and then after these kind of operations are carried out, whether or not the intended target was in fact hit, or if there is any collateral damage, if it's inside of an armed conflict situation. If it's outside of that, if human rights is the guiding principle rather than the laws of war, then there's a really narrow ability to use that force. And that's why it matters, I think, to get that sort of transparency and accountability. And that's what we push for in a lot of the work that I do. You see that these are links. I don't have enough time to go into all of this stuff, so I'm happy to share this PowerPoint in case you might be interested to know more about this. Just let me know afterwards. That's my main focus, the human rights issues and other legal questions surrounding the use of armed drones. This is also a bit of an outdated list, but it is a technology that's relatively inexpensive. That's questionable as well, because if you're talking about just the machine itself, of course it's cheaper than an F-16, but as far as the kind of ground personnel that need to be present in order to get these things up and operating, it also is an increased expense. But that list will only continue to grow of countries that actually have them and are using them in military operational capacities. So why drones? Well, why would you use them? It offers the obvious advantage, you don't have to put boots on the ground, right? And so that, from the user perspective, is a huge advantage. You don't put your own soldiers in harm's way. Then in turn, you have this smaller footprint of troops overseas. You're not sort of seen necessarily as the world's policemen, although again, that I'd like to offer a bit of pushback there. We're just policing perhaps in a bit of a different way. They are armed with missiles, and those are able to target more precisely, as I mentioned earlier, theoretically. If you're able to hover around and you make sure that you're striking at a time where civilians are not present, that can be a much more precise tactic. And it's an opportunity to integrate intelligence with decisions to use force in a way that conventional weapons platforms may not have been able to do. And so, overall, you can say that drones offer the opportunity to achieve your objectives, counterterrorism or otherwise, with a lower overall risk. Now, from the other side of that, the missiles don't always target precisely because they're based on, of course, human intelligence, which we all know can be faulty. So it's not really the missiles that don't target precisely, but it's the people firing those missiles remotely. Intel can be wrong, just as with any other weapons platform. We have seen a marked increase, as I mentioned earlier, of the incidence of civilian casualties. And that's really what it is for me, what it's about, why drones are problematic. We're using them in places that we haven't before, and we're doing it against people in a wider range of people than we have before, because we're operating in this sort of area of counterterrorism, which gets blurry around the edges from a legal perspective. And so when people die, again, this can happen in war, and we do accept that under the laws of war. So we're not looking for a magic machine that only kills the bad guys. The problem is that we're just being sold the narrative that the people we're killing are just the bad guys, but we have no way of finding out, right? Because these are happening, these kinds of strikes are occurring, as I mentioned, in places that are very difficult to access in order to sort of confirm. So from a perspective of accountability, transparency, what we plead for with all kinds of different governments at the international, national, and European level is be upfront with what you're doing as far as, what's your legal framework. You need to let us know who you're targeting and for what reason. Are they a combatant? Are they not? Is this outside the laws of war? That kind of stuff, I think, is just basic level of knowledge that we should have as a public in order to know, in this situation, all of us, hopefully, are tax-paying citizens, what we're funding and what's happening with the kind of military budget that we have in this country. We're seeing, because of the rapid proliferation, is that there's a lot more force being used in these kind of areas of conflict or hostilities. And so essentially one metaphor that could be used is that whenever you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So the idea is that you've got this machine. The Netherlands is about to purchase 4 Reaper drones. So they have that machine, they're going to want to use it. So in that sense, they want to put it in practice and set it out, surveilling, sharing intelligence, and ultimately the plan is also to arm them. So that's one issue we have to keep on our radar. And that leads to then this idea of this everywhere war phenomenon. Because we're right now at war with, and I don't know what the exact legal terminology is that the Trump administration is using, but the Obama administration used the war with Al-Qaeda and its affiliated forces without defining what an affiliated force was. So it's really important to know with whom we're at war in order to know then who can be targeted, and then when people die outside of that particular category, it's important to know what kind of accountability there would be for that, okay? Again, that last point that was an advantage, that there's a lower overall risk, that only applies, of course, to the user, not those in countries where drones are being used, okay? There's also, right now, the academic literature is still not quite clear on it, but there is a growing number of studies being done with respect to what happens when you don't have boots on the ground. You don't have the support forces who would be there to kind of support the local population. So, for example, in Yemen, where there's no real US presence on the ground, there are bombs being dropped against Al-Qaeda, for example, and who's filling that vacuum? So when a school is bombed or when houses are destroyed in a particular strike, the people who are filling that void is not the United States or its allies, but rather insurgents that are on the ground. And these people are just after basic, shelter and food. They're trying to get their lives back together. And when the Al-Qaeda operatives step up and provide that, it's only a human response to sort of be influenced by that, and that does have a tendency to then to create more of the problem we're trying to solve in that sense. Okay, so what can be done? In 2013, I was able to work together with this gentleman here. He's the former Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights. His name is Ben Emerson, and he did an inquiry into the civilian impact of drone strikes. And we studied several different countries where drone strikes were occurring, just to find out what kind of effects it was having on the local population, and what it was also doing with respect to international law. There we go. We presented our final report to the General Assembly in 2014. We created a legal framework saying what the law is, not what the law should be, but rather what the international law is, how to operate within that. And we actually called for an international consensus on the use of armed drones, which we don't have yet, but we're still calling for it. After that particular report, I was also, the European Parliament also called for something similar. And you're going to hear the same kind of words coming out of my mouth the entire time. They want more transparency. They want more accountability. I, for one, am not, just to put my cards on the table, I, for one, am not anti-drone, but I am pro-law and working within the framework that already exists. The international legal framework, both under human rights law and the laws of war, we don't need a new treaty, right? We don't need a drones treaty. We need to agree upon what the provisions that already exist, what those mean with respect to this kind of use of force. And so, again, we call on states to articulate what that may mean, and then also to be very transparent and accountable when things go wrong. There was a call in 2014 for the common EU position on drone use, and then more recommendations at the international level. That's what the UN is very good at, is making a lot of recommendations. But also to support research and initiatives that do happen then on a more local and focused level. The Human Rights Council of the UN also passed a resolution also calling to follow the provisions outlined in international law. Again, there's no need for a new treaty on regulating this kind of technology. The law is there. It's just a question of following it to the letter of the law, which is what we try to push for. There was this panel in September 2014 that was convened. And then moving quickly through, I'm also featuring myself. I spoke last year as an invited expert to the European Parliament about, as a follow-up to their call for a common position. I was asked to write a report, which you can find again in this link, outlining what the law is with respect to drone use and what's important for moving forward as more countries acquire this technology. So those are things that have happened at the international and European level. Civil society, non-governmental organizations, of course, we're not quiet people. We've been active as well. There's a network of something like 30 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are part of this European Forum on Armed Drones. That is a platform. I'll talk to you in just a second about what the action points are, what we're trying to do. It won't surprise you, I've said all of the things already. We also cooperate with partners here in the United States, so this is not an isolated European initiative. We have a number of NGOs across the pond as well, and then we're also reaching out to those in the Middle East. We have a couple in Yemen who work together with us closely, as well as Northern Africa. And then we also have academic networks, but I won't get into that, it's a bit wordy, so we'll skip ahead. But what do we ask for? As I mentioned earlier, we want governments to articulate clear policies. If you have these machines, fine, tell us how you're going to use them. If you plan to use them in an armed conflict situation, define what that is. If you're in an armed conflict with a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda and its affiliated forces, spell out who are the affiliated forces, instead of just saying with, kind of whoever we target, because that's the end result that we've seen with the Obama administration specifically, is that they, and Barack Obama was a very bright and brilliant, and is still a constitutional lawyer, so that man knew his law well, and he kept it vague, and I think I can understand why, because that from a political or a policy perspective allowed for more maneuvering. But if I'm being honest with Professor Obama, his legal memos to justify the use of force wouldn't have passed my first year law class, based on the fact that the definitions that they were using didn't really comport with what the law says. And so we ask for clear policies. We ask, articulate your policies, but make sure you're clear about it. Yes, please.
I have a question about how realistic is it for them to name these terrorist groups when we keep finding it feels as though, the way the media portrays it, that we just kind of stumble upon these groups and they're, how far ahead do we think we know to announce that we're coming after that particular group or these particular terrorists?
Thanks for that question. I think it's a good one because it is hard. Terrorism is a hard thing. Terrorism is not defined. The United States doesn't really have a clear definition of what it is we're going after. There's no international definition of what terrorism is. I've heard people sort of callously say it's like art, you know it when you see it. So in that sense, we don't know which kind of groups may be offshoots of Al-Qaeda or affiliated forces. The other side of that is, in an ex post facto situation, after you've carried out a strike, there shouldn't be any problem with saying, this was our target, he was a member of this force, this is how he is connected, or she, I don't want to be gender discriminatory here, this is how this person is connected to a particular group, so that's also what we're pushing for. So you're right to say that these things they're blurry and they're shooting off and they may morph from this particular group to another, but under international law, it's very important that if we're talking about a situation that we're already in an armed conflict, so the laws of war are applying, the people that we're targeting need to be then a combatant under that particular area of law. And if they are, for example, somebody who writes a propaganda magazine for a particular group, is that person directly participating in hostilities? He's urging people to join the fight, perhaps, but does that go far enough? My answer would be no, without further facts showing that he's actually participating in the hostilities. So I think it's a really nuanced discussion, and I'm not trying to avoid answering it, but it's really important that whenever we've identified this particular group or members of an organization, that we're upfront with the American people, or the allies are upfront with their people, because once upon a time we needed a congressional authorization to go to war. And these affiliated forces, which now 17 years and counting past 9/11, had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. They're sort of morphing, and this thing has become a very amorphous conflict, and it's really important that we come back to basics and say, okay, if you're targeting, against whom are you, against which faction or group, in order to kind of be accountable to the American people. So I hope that helps.
Very helpful, thank you. Do you know, I am reading that ISIS has drones now and they're using them. So how are you going to, are they going to be a part of this?
Sure, absolutely, and that's also why we asked for, I want to just highlight the other things we're asking for really quickly, and I'm going to get back to that. We ask for ensured transparency, accountability when things go wrong, avoiding complicity, so don't share information with people who are breaking the law, so states who may not be acting within the bounds of law. The Dutch shouldn't give intelligence information to the United States if they think they're acting illegally. The final one is to control for proliferation. So the idea is that this technology is increasing, it's proliferating. The United States is selling a lot of drones to allies, and I do understand recently Trump has relaxed the proliferation standards. It used to be just to allies through a very strict process. It's now a much lower standard in order to sell those machines. War is good for business, but is it good for precedent in that sense, right? Because the idea is what you're saying. ISIS is now acquiring drones. At this point, they've not got their hands on the big guns. But the principles, what we're doing, the way that we are using force in the United States by these kinds of drones, when ISIS can get something on Amazon, right? Any of us could do that. Attach a few hand grenades to it, drop it over a crowded market. But they could follow the same kind of logic in some sense, that they're at war with us just as we are at war with them. So then all of us, citizens, are fair game, because it's kind of the precedent the United States has set for citizens elsewhere and civilian casualties. So in that sense, I hope that answers it.
What you're saying is unrealistic. I'm sorry.
That's fair.
It is. For the military, you cannot regulate everything that they do.
Well, we regulate almost everything that they do, and they regulate it themselves. And I think the importance of regulation is not only in the interest of us human rights types, but also in the interest of military legitimacy, right? If you want to be perceived as a legitimate military, you have an interest in following your own field manual, right? You have an interest in being true to the rules of engagement that are set out and based in international law. When you start throwing those out, perhaps, and we hear that argument a lot, because the enemy doesn't follow the same rules, why should we? Then you're dropping your standards to an unacceptable level. So in that sense, regulation, we regulate by treaty or otherwise, we regulate almost every single thing that the military does, and the military regulates themselves based on those standards we've all accepted in the international community. So I guess to push back on that is that it's really important that we do stay true to those values and laws. I saw another hand, yeah.
Yeah, I was reading this forensic report. It's called online, and it said Trump had been, you got to take it with a grain of salt, of course, it's online, but the Trump administration was thinking of going big time after these Mexican drug cartels with drones, and you know, that, I just wanted to see what you thought, if that was realistic or if that could really be in the works.
Well, my first response, I haven't heard that, but it terrifies me to hear that if they are using force against, in a law enforcement context, so going after drug cartels, right? So they have to understand a bit more of the context. But if they're using drones for surveillance purposes, I suppose they don't have as much of an issue. But if they're going to strap missiles,
Armed to take them out.
yeah, that terrifies me, to be honest. And I hope that others in this room are also terrified, because that's a law enforcement situation. And going back to the first remarks about the Kansas Highway Patrol not arming their drones.
But they were looking at it as a terrorist thing. There's been over 50,000 civilians killed by the cartels in 3 years, and it's fomenting the border problems. And the idea was that they could do something about the cartels and kind of calm it down.
Well, I would urge our fair president not to do that. But that's for a number of reasons. Because I don't think that drones are the answer to law enforcement problems. And I think if we could switch gears a little and think about that, think about if we have armed drones used here for law enforcement issues. I think we'd all be pretty uncomfortable with that. And so the fact that I'm not trying to completely dismiss that, of course those are issues, but they don't rise to the level of needing a military grade weapon to engage with that kind of stuff. But it's a huge law enforcement problem, but that is governed by international human rights law rather than the laws of war. And I think that distinction needs to remain. So one more hand really quickly. Yeah.
My question is more broad. It's in my mind, the war has slipped from the front where the fighting was kind of, the civilians were off, the military was the military, and it wouldn't bomb mommies and babies and hospitals, and that now our wars look very different. And so as we're combating nations that are redefining how they participate in war, how does the human rights civil call respond? How do we take preemptive, okay, we want to set an example, you're using chemical weapons, but what do you think the happy medium becomes besides transparency? What would you say, okay, they're using sarin gas, go get the little creeps. Where do you think the human rights people would draw a line?
I'm going to try to unpack what you just asked. There's a lot of stuff there because the sarin gas thing, I think you might be referring to Syria, where there is a recognized armed conflict. I'm not aware of sarin gas being used in any of the other conflicts where we're active right now. But to your earlier point about that our wars look different, that's true. And I think in a lot of respects, that's a really good thing. We're no longer nation state versus nation state fighting it out on the front lines of battle like we did in World Wars I and II. Thank goodness. We have moved on past that. We have a diplomatic way to settle our differences, and that oftentimes works. It's not all the time. The UN has a lot of imperfections. But there are options to do that. What I think, one thing I'd like to key in, what you mentioned was that we sort of, our standards, have dropped, but I think the United States was part of that shift in its response to 9/11. When criminals carried out horrific criminal acts, we elevated that group of criminals to a state-like status. We said, we're going to go to war with you, horrible criminal people. And the UN was behind it, and our allies were behind it, and we set off to take them out. What we did there was this group of criminals, again, like I said, we've elevated them to a status of, we can go to war now with non-state actors. So that's what's now the situation. We've gotten ourselves into that mess. It's not a mess we can't get out of, though. And I think you've mentioned it's a happy medium. I wouldn't call it a happy medium. I'd say this is 70 years of law since the Second World War. We've built it up to be what it is now. It's sufficient to address these issues, human rights law I'm talking about, and the laws of war. When you're in a war situation, these are the rules that apply. Stay true to those rules, everything's fine. If you act outside of those rules, which can happen, be accountable to that. Show that you're a legitimate military actor to say, you are out of line here. We do not stand for that. I don't think, and I'm just speaking as a personal citizen of this country, I don't think that we're a better country by selling out our values and ideals, which is what I perceive is happening with respect to the way that we're kind of stooping down to a level we don't need to, right? So in that sense, I think the happy medium is to go back to those basics, look at the human rights principles and the laws of war, make sure that we're sticking to those, because if we don't do that, then we're making the choice to act in a way that's similar to those people whom we're fighting. I see that you're here, Grace.
Jessica, thank you so much for talking to us about that extremely difficult and important topic. We're very grateful for you coming today, and we have a tradition of providing a book to a local school. Today's book is called Earth, My First 4.54 Billion Years. So we'd like you to sign this before you leave. And then also we'd like to present you with this year's Rotary theme coin, which is really pretty, but it also has the 4-way test on the back. Jessica tells me she is a former Rotarian, and hopefully when she goes back to the Netherlands, she will consider joining again. So thank you again. We're really grateful.
And thanks, everyone.
clarify, I wasn't very clear about these little sign-up sheets, registration. If you would like to register for either the reception or the dinner or both on June 14th, you can go ahead and turn those in today. Talk to Linda. If you want to pay by credit card, she can do that, right? Yes, I see a nod back there. Next week was June 7th, and we will be meeting at the Brown v. Board School on Monroe Street, and the program will be Sarah Frizzell from Arts Connect, and she'll be talking to us about the mural projects that are actually have happened around the city and that they're doing there. We will also, after the meeting, have an opportunity to help paint the mural that's going to be installed at that location. Now, Joni tells me that aprons will be provided, but that the paint does not come out of your clothing. So if you plan to paint, you might want to wear your paint clothes. So if you will stand, and we will close with the four-way test plus one. Of the things we think, say, or do, is it true? Is it fair? All concerned? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And will it be fun?